Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are tackling a giant, and I mean a real heavyweight.
Oh, absolutely. The undisputed champion of biology.
Right. We are talking about Charles Darwin, but before we get into the sources today, I want you to just close your eyes for a second.
Assuming you are not driving, of course.
Yeah, safety first, please. But just metaphorically close your eyes. When I say the name Darwin, what do you see?
I mean, I imagine most people just see the beard. You know, that formidable Gandalf-like beard.
Definitely the beard. But where is he? Because usually we picture this young, rugged adventurer, right? He is standing on the deck of a wooden sailing ship.
The HMS Beagle.
Exactly. The salt sprays in his hair. He is stepping onto the volcanic rocks of the Galapagos Islands. He looks at a finch and suddenly, snap, the theory of evolution just pops into his head.
Like a light bulb.
Yeah. It is so cinematic. It is basically Indiana Jones meets science.
It is a very romantic image.
Yeah?
And it is the standard textbook narrative.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the lonely genius out in the wild, decoding the secrets of nature halfway across the globe.
But looking at the source material we have today, specifically Steve Jones's analysis in Darwin's Island, that image is, well, it is not just slightly off. It is almost entirely wrong.
Yeah, it is a myth that really obscures the man. The reality is considerably less swashbuckling and considerably more, well, domestic.
This is what really surprised me diving into this. We define Darwin by that voyage, but the reality is the Beagle voyage was 5 years long. How long was he actually in the Galapagos?
5 weeks.
5 weeks? I mean, people take honeymoons longer than that.
Precisely. And while he was there, he did not even have a eureka moment. In fact, he barely realized the significance of what he was seeing.
Right, because of the finches.
Yeah, he collected the finches, yes.
Yeah.
But he just threw them all into a bag without tagging which island they came from.
That is just terrible science.
He thought they were a mixture of blackbirds and wrens and finches. He made a complete mess of the data collection.
So he did not even know they were all finches at the time.
Not at all. Not until he got back to London and an ornithologist, John Gould, looked at them and said, "Charles, these are all the same type of bird."
Wow.
The insight did not happen on a volcano. It happened in a dusty office in London.
So the Indiana Jones phase was short and, frankly, a bit sloppy. But the real work, the work that actually changed the world, happened later.
It happened at Downhouse.
Yeah.
In Kent, England. A so-called Garden of England.
And this is the setting for our deep dive today. This is the mission. Darwin comes back in 1836. He moves to this house, and he basically never leaves England again. He becomes a total recluse.
Recluse might be a bit too strong. But he certainly withdrew. He actually described himself in the local directory simply as a farmer.
A farmer.
Yeah. He bought this house, which he initially thought was dull and ugly, and he turned it into a scientific fortress. But we really have to understand why he withdrew. He wasn't just being antisocial. He was incredibly ill.
The sources go into detail on this, and it sounds miserable. It wasn't just feeling a bit under the weather.
Oh, no. It was a chronic, debilitating condition. He suffered from violent vomiting, shivering, fits, severe flatulence, and just utter exhaustion.
Yeah, he kept a diary of his symptoms, and it is, frankly, depressing to read.
He was often too weak to work for more than an hour or two a day.
Which makes what he accomplished even more insane when you think about it. But this confinement is actually the key, isn't it? Because he couldn't go back to the Amazon. He had to find the Amazon in his own backyard.
That is the absolute core of the disregarded Darwin. We focus so much on the origin of species, which is obviously monumental. But that book is just the tip of the iceberg. Darwin wrote 6 million words.
6 million.
He published 19 books. And the vast majority of them were about things that seem incredibly mundane on the surface.
Barnacles.
Barnacles, earthworms, orchids,
Yeah.
climbing plants.
Right.
He studied the way his children smiled, the way a worm pulls a leaf into its burrow.
I have to admit, when I saw barnacles on the reading list, I thought, okay, surely we can skip this part. But the more I read, the more I realized he spent 8 years on barnacles. Why? Was he just procrastinating on writing the origin?
That is the million-dollar question in the history of science. Some historians think he was terrified of the backlash his theory would cause, so he just hid in the barnacles.
Which makes sense.
But scientifically, he was building the armor for his theory. He needed to understand variation. If you look at a million barnacles and realize that no two are identical, you start to understand the raw material that natural selection acts upon.
He wasn't procrastinating. He was stress testing his idea against the dullest, most common creatures he could find.
Exactly.
So that is our mission for this deep dive. We are going to explore the Darwin who found the secrets of the universe in his own garden. We are going to look at the naked ape, the emotional animal, the plants that eat meat, which I'm very excited to talk about, and the scandalous science of inbreeding within his own family.
It is a journey from the very small to the very large, because for Darwin there was no difference. The forces that shaped a worm were the exact same forces that shaped a human being.
So let's jump right into segment 1, the naked ape. We're going to talk about human ancestry, but I want to start with a scene that feels like it belongs in a period drama. We have Queen Victoria, the ultimate symbol of the empire, visiting the London Zoo in 1842.
It is a fascinating historical moment.
Yeah.
You have to remember, most people in England at that time had never seen a great ape. It was an absolute sensation. The zoo had acquired an orangutan named Jenny.
And the Queen's reaction was, well, it wasn't exactly warm and fuzzy.
She was deeply unsettled. She wrote in her diary that the orangutan was too wonderful, but also frightfully and painfully and disagreeably human.
Disagreeably human. That is such a loaded phrase. It is almost like the uncanny valley. Before we even had a name for it, she looked at this animal and saw a reflection that she just really didn't like.
She saw the resemblance, and it revolted her. She wanted to be distinct. Now, Darwin had visited Jenny a few years earlier, and he saw the exact same thing.
The mannerisms, right?
Yeah, the mannerisms, the way she threw a tantrum when she didn't get an apple. But his reaction was the complete opposite. He didn't feel disgust. He felt a profound connection.
He scribbled in his notebook, "Man in his arrogance thinks himself a great work. More humble, and I believe true, to consider him created from animals."
That is the core conflict, isn't it?
Yeah.
Arrogance versus humility. But when he finally published his ideas on human evolution, the public definitely sided with the Queen.
Oh, absolutely. It caused an uproar. Benjamin Disraeli, the future prime minister, famously crystallized the whole debate. He asked the crowd, "Is man an ape or an angel?" And he declared, "I'm on the side of the angels."
It is catchy, ape or angel. And the press had an absolute field day with it. The cartoons of Darwin with a monkey body, the shaved monkey caricatures.
Denny S. Gilbert even wrote a line for it. "Darwinian man, though well-behaved at best, is only a monkey shaved."
It became a massive pop culture phenomenon. But beneath the jokes, there was this deep, deep anxiety. The Victorians wanted to be special. They wanted to be set apart from the brutes. They wanted a divine spark, not a biological link to Jenny the orangutan.
But today, for you listening, we don't have to rely on looking at Jenny and saying, hey, she has ears like mine. We have the receipts. We have the genetic evidence. And the source material draws this really cool comparison between two types of immortality to explain this.
Yeah, the auto-icon.
Jeremy Bentham.
Right. Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian philosopher. He had his body preserved and stuffed. You can still see him sitting in a wooden box at University College London today.
Right.
That was his attempt at immortality, preserving the physical shell.
Which is incredibly creepy to look at.
Very creepy. But compare that to James Watson, one of the discoverers of the DNA double helix. He was presented with his own auto-icon, but it was a CD containing his entire DNA sequence.
One is a dusty old body, the other is digital code.
Precisely. And that code tells us a story that Darwin could only really guess at. When the Human Genome Project was completed, we got some massive surprises. For one, the sheer number of genes. We used to think humans were so incredibly complex we must have 100,000 genes.
In the reality.
About 20,000. That is it. That is roughly the same number as a microscopic worm. C. elegans.
Just a tiny worm.
Yes, we do not have a massive library of unique human genes.
That is such a blow to human exceptionalism. If I had the same number of genes as a tiny worm, why am I so different?
It is not about the number of genes. It is about the regulation. The switches. Evolution isn't just about writing new chapters. It is about editing. It is about when you turn a gene on how loud you shout it and when you silence it entirely.
So let's look at the comparison with chimps then. We always hear that 99% number, right? We are 99% genetically identical to chimpanzees.
It is a staggering statistic. It means that the difference between writing a symphony and throwing dung is found in that tiny 1% margin. But what is really interesting is that a lot of that 1% difference isn't about what we gained, but what we lost.
This is the less is more idea.
Exactly. Take muscle strength, for example. Chimps are incredibly strong, far stronger than humans. They can rip a car door off its hinges. We are basically weaklings. Why?
I always assumed it was just because we stopped climbing trees.
Partly, yes. But there is a specific genetic mutation at play here, the MYH16 gene. In chimps and other apes, this gene is highly active, and it builds massive, powerful jaw muscles. If you look at a gorilla skull, it actually has a bony crest on top.
Right, a ridge.
A sagittal crest. It is a ridge where these massive jaw muscles attach all the way to the top of the head.
Okay, so what about us?
In humans, that gene is broken. It is what we call a pseudogene. A mutation about 2.4 million years ago just switched it off. So our jaw muscles shrank. Now that sounds like a bad thing. Oh, we got weaker.
Yeah.
But think about the physics of the skull.
If you have massive muscles wrapped tightly around your head.
They act like a clamp.
Yeah.
They physically restrict the growth of the cranium. When we lost that muscle mass, the clamp was released. The skull was finally free to expand.
Wow.
That broken gene likely allowed for the massive explosion in brain size that defines us as a species. We traded bite force for brain power.
That is completely fascinating. So we literally broke a gene to build a bigger brain.
And we see the exact same thing with our sense of smell, too. We have hundreds of genes for detecting scents that are just broken. They are rusted shut in our genome. We traded our sense of smell for better vision and complex social processing. We are essentially a patchwork of broken parts that somehow works better together than the original model.
Darwin called this the indelible stamp, right?
Yes, the last line of the Descent of Man. He writes that despite all our noble qualities, our godlike intellect man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. We are biological machines cobbled together from spare parts.
And one of the most visible stamps is our skin. This is something the sources go into deep detail on, and it really overturns the traditional image of Adam and Eve.
Oh, completely overturns it. If you look at classical religious art, Adam and Eve are almost always depicted as white Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
But biology tells us unequivocally that the first modern humans were black.
So how did we get from there to the huge variety of skin tones we see today? It isn't just random drift.
No, it is a brutal calculation of biochemistry. It comes down to two specific things: folic acid and vitamin D.
Okay, let's unpack this for everyone. Why do we need dark skin initially?
Protection. In the strong tropical sun of Africa, UV radiation is extremely intense, and UV light actually destroys folic acid in the blood.
And folic acid is crucial for pregnant women, right?
Yes, it is crucial for fetal development. Without it, you get terrible birth defects like spina bifida. So natural selection heavily favored high levels of melanin dark skin to act as a physical shield. It preserves the folic acid so you can have healthy babies.
So dark skin is the absolute default for high sun environments. But then humans started migrating. We moved north out of Africa. We went to cloudy, rainy places like England.
And there, the biological equation flips entirely. You don't have enough sun anymore. You need UV light to penetrate the skin to synthesize vitamin D. And vitamin D is essential for building bones and supporting the immune system. If you have dark skin in a cloudy climate, you block out the tiny bit of UV there actually is. You become severely vitamin D deficient.
And that leads to rickets.
The Victorian demon. Rickets causes soft bones, bowed legs, pelvic deformities. It was absolutely rampant in the smoggy industrial cities of Victorian England. So lighter skin wasn't a choice. It was a genetic mutation that allowed people to soak up every single scrap of sunlight just to make vitamin D. It was a survival mechanism to prevent their children's bones from turning to rubber.
And here's where it gets really, really interesting. Convergent evolution. Because Europeans aren't the only ones with light skin.
Correct. East Asians also evolved pale skin, but through entirely different genetic mutations. They arrived at the exact same solution via a different chemical pathway.
It's like two people independently inventing the wheel on opposite sides of the world.
It proves that skin color is just a local adaptation to latitude and cloud cover. It is literally geography written on the human body.
It really highlights how surface level these differences are. Speaking of surface level details that reveal deep truths, let's move to segment 2, the emotional animal. This is where Darwin starts looking at psychology as a form of biology.
This brings us to his book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Other Animals. This was a completely groundbreaking book. Before this, the prevailing view championed by an anatomist named Charles Bell was that facial expressions were God-given.
Right, like we were special.
Exactly. Bell argued that humans had special, unique muscles in their face, solely designed to express morality or piety to the Creator.
And Darwin read that and said, no, that is nonsense. A smile is a biological function.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He argued that emotions and the way we express them are evolved traits, just like a hand or a liver. These serve a functional purpose. And to prove it, he did something very modern. He crowdsourced his data.
He didn't have the internet, obviously, so how did he do it?
He used the reach of the British Empire. He wrote questionnaires and sent them to missionaries, colonial officers, and station masters all over the globe. He asked them very specific questions. When a person is sad, do the corners of their mouth turn down? When they are happy, do their eyes crinkle?
And what did the data show?
Universalism. It did not matter if you were a London banker or a tribesman in the highlands of New Guinea. A smile is a smile. A look of grief is a look of grief. These expressions aren't culturally learned, they are hardwired into our biology.
But there is one expression that actually is uniquely human, right? Blushing. Mark Twain had that great quote, "Man is the animal that blushes."
Or has occasion to, yes.
Okay.
Darwin was frankly obsessed with blushing. He called it the most peculiar and most human of all expressions.
It is weird when you stop and think about it. Why would evolution want us to advertise our shame? If I make a social mistake, surely the best biological strategy is to play it cool, not turn bright red and tell everyone, hey, look, I messed up.
That is the evolutionary paradox. But Darwin realized it is a powerful social signal. Humans are hypersocial animals. We rely entirely on the group to survive. If you break a social rule, the group might reject you. And out in the wild, rejection means death. Blushing is an involuntary signal of contrition. It says, I know I broke the rules. I value your opinion. I am embarrassed.
So it is a peace offering, an appeasement display.
Exactly. Modern psychological studies show that people who blush after making a mistake are forgiven much more easily than those who don't. It actively de-escalates aggression. It is a physiological mechanism to keep the tribe together.
So my bright red face is actually saving me from getting punched.
In a biological sense, yes. It signals submission and adherence to the social contract. You can't fake a blush, so it is an honest signal.
Now, we talked about the similarities between us and apes, but this segment also really highlights the differences, specifically reading the mind.
This is a crucial distinction to make. Chimpanzees are incredibly smart. They absolutely have culture. They use sticks to fish for termites. They crack nuts with stones. But there's one thing they rarely, if ever, do. They do not teach.
They don't teach their young.
A mother chimp will not correct her baby if it is holding the termite stick wrong. She won't demonstrate the technique slowly so the baby can learn. She just does it, and the baby has to figure it out purely by observing. They lack what developmental psychologists call theory of mind.
The ability to understand that someone else doesn't know what you know.
Exactly. They can't conceptualize the ignorance of another.
Whereas humans are the eloquent ape, we never shut up. We are constantly teaching, pointing, correcting, sharing information with each other.
And our actual bodies reflect that collaborative nature. Look at our eyes. Humans are the only primates with highly visible whites of the eyes, the sclera.
I never really thought about that. Chimp eyes are entirely dark, right?
Mostly dark, yes. The bright white sclera makes it extremely easy to see exactly where someone is looking. If I subtly glance at the door, you immediately look at the door too. I am signaling my attention to you. For a cooperative hunting and gathering species, that is a massive advantage. We share attention.
But for a chimp.
For a chimp who might be competing for a piece of fruit or a mate, revealing your gaze is a disadvantage. You want to keep your intentions hidden from your rivals.
So our eyes are literally designed for collaboration. That is beautiful. But what happens when that social system breaks down? The source material brings up the story of the wild boy of Aveyron.
This is a tragic but deeply illuminating story from 1797. A boy named Victor was found wandering the woods in France. He was estimated to be about 12 years old. He had been raised in total isolation, no parents, no language, no society whatsoever.
And a famous doctor, Dr. Itard, tried to civilize him.
Yes. Itard was a product of the Enlightenment. He thought that humanity was simply a matter of education. He thought he could teach Victor to speak to love, to be a proper gentleman. But he failed completely. Victor never learned to speak a language. He never learned to emotionally bond. He remained essentially in a wild state.
Why did it fail so totally?
Because the biological window had closed. Our brains are social organs. They require social input to properly develop during childhood. Victor's social radar, his ability to read faces, to mirror emotions, had simply atrophied. It connects directly to our modern understanding of the brain and extreme isolation.
It sounds a lot like how we describe autism today, a difficulty in reading those intricate social cues.
It is often framed that way, yes. Autism can be seen as a variation where that social radar functions differently. Victor's case is an extreme environmental example of what happens when the brain receives absolutely no social input during its formative years. It confirms that we are not self-made creatures. We are physically built by our interactions with others.
Which perfectly explains why solitary confinement is such a devastating punishment.
It is the ultimate torture for a human being. To cut us off from other minds is to destroy the very thing that makes us biologically human. We wither without that connection, just like a plant withers without water.
Speaking of plants, let's pivot to something that sounds like it is straight out of science fiction, but is 100% real. Segment 3. The green tyrannosaurs.
The plants that eat meat.
I have to admit, this is my favorite part of the deep dive. The source material sets the scene on Mount Roraima in Venezuela, the famous Lost World.
Right, it was the direct inspiration for Arthur Conan Doyle's novel, The Lost World. He imagined dinosaurs surviving up there on that plateau, but the real monsters are much smaller and they are green.
Why are there so many carnivorous plants in these specific, isolated places? Like, why turn to a life of crime, basically?
It comes down to basic biological economics, the nitrogen economy. Mount Roraima and bogs in general are terrible places for plants to live. The constant rain washes away all the nutrients, the soil is completely starving, it has virtually no nitrogen. And nitrogen is the fundamental building block of life. It is in DNA, it is in proteins.
So if you cannot get nitrogen from the dirt beneath you, where do you get it?
From the things crawling on top of the dirt. Insects are basically little flying packets of pure nitrogen. So evolution, in its infinite creativity, came up with a radical solution. Just eat the bugs.
And what is crazy is that this happened multiple times, right? It is not just one weird family of plants.
This is convergent evolution at its absolute finest. Completely unrelated species facing the exact same problem came up with the exact same solution independently. You have sundews, which use sticky flypaper glue. You have Venus flytraps, which use fast snap traps. You have pitcher plants, which use deep pitfalls. They're all genetically unrelated, but they all turned into hunters.
And Darwin was obsessed with these. He basically treated them like pets in his greenhouse.
He really did. He fed them roast beef.
Roast beef.
He fed them cheese. He even peed on them, or at least the text says he used urine. And since he was often working entirely alone in the greenhouse,
We can safely infer the source of the urine. But I really want to get into the physical mechanism of the Venus flytrap, because plants don't have muscles, and they certainly don't have brains. So how does a vegetable move fast enough to catch a living fly?
this is where Darwin was eerily prescient. He suspected they had something akin to an animal nervous system, and modern biology has proved him entirely right. It is electricity.
Real electricity, like a nerve.
Action potentials. The exact same mechanism is in your own body. When a fly touches one of those tiny trigger hairs inside the trap, it physically deforms the base of the hair. That mechanical pressure opens up ion channels, little gates in the cell membrane. Calcium ions rush in, creating a literal electrical spike that travels rapidly across the surface of the leaf.
Just like a neuron firing in a brain.
Almost exactly. But here's the true genius part of the mechanism, the memory. If the hair is touched only once, nothing happens.
Which is a brilliant safety mechanism, right? Because if it closed every time a raindrop hit, it would waste all its energy.
Exactly. Closing the trap is energetically very expensive for a plant. It is like a human sprinting. You don't want to sprint for a false alarm. So the plant waits. The first touch primes the system. It builds up a stored electrical charge, but not quite enough to trigger the snap. It essentially sets a timer. If a second touch happens within about 20-second snap, the electrical charge crosses the threshold, the cells instantly change shape from convex to concave, and the trap shuts tight.
That is basically an analog computer. It is computing input 1 plus input 2 equals action.
It is pure biological computation. And once it captures the bug, the digestion begins. Darwin found that the digestive juices inside a pitcher plant are almost chemically identical to the hydrochloric acid and pepsin found in your own stomach.
So if I were tiny and fell into a giant pitcher plant,
You would be chemically digested just like a piece of steak.
good to know. Note to self, stay away from giant pitcher plants.
That's it.
But it is not just about eating the bugs. Sometimes these plants hire the bugs to do their dirty work. Tell us about the Devil's Gardens.
This is the fascinating Ant-Acacia alliance. Down in the Amazon, there are certain trees acacias that are absolutely covered in ferocious biting ants. The tree actively provides hollow thorns for the ants to live inside, and it produces sweet nectar at the base of its leaves specifically for them to eat.
So it is providing a bed and breakfast.
More like a military barracks. Because in exchange, the ants act as a standing army. If a caterpillar tries to eat a leaf, the ants swarm and attack it. If a competing vine tries to grow on the tree's trunk, the ants will actually cut it down. They clear all the vegetation around the tree, creating what locals call a devil's garden.
But the source material is very clear to call this a biological marketplace, not a friendship.
It is strictly transactional, and sometimes it gets incredibly nasty. Some ants cheat the system, they take the nectar, but they don't bother defending the tree. And some trees cheat back. They might chemically castrate the ants.
Wait, hold on. The tree castrates the ants?
Chemically, yes. Some acacias produce a specific enzyme in the nectar that disables the ant's ability to digest sugar from any other source, or it actively suppresses their reproductive systems, making them completely dependent on that specific tree and forcing them to be more focused on defense rather than raising young. It is essentially biological slavery.
That is so dark. Nature really is red in tooth and claw, even for the leafy green plants.
And here is the sobering modern connection to all of this. All of these incredible adaptations, the snap traps, the chemical alliances, are driven entirely by a severe shortage of nitrogen.
Ugh.
But humans are rapidly changing that equation.
With artificial fertilizers.
Yes. We are pumping so much artificial nitrogen into the biosphere through industrial agriculture and pollution that it is literally raining down on these pristine bogs.
So if the soil suddenly becomes rich,
The green tyrannosaurs lose their evolutionary edge. It takes a massive amount of energy to build a complex flytrap. If you can just suck nitrogen easily out of the soil like a normal weed, the normal weeds will outgrow you in days. The carnivorous plants are being actively outcompeted and driven to extinction simply because we are feeding them too well. We are turning these unique lost worlds into completely generic gardens.
that is just tragic. We are destroying millions of years of brilliant evolutionary engineering just by dusting our crops.
It really is. It is a stark reminder of how incredibly delicate these evolutionary niches are.
All right, let's move to our final segment. Segment 4, the triumph of the well-bred. This brings the story right back to Darwin's own family, and it deals with a topic that is, well, a little uncomfortable for modern ears.
Inbreeding.
Yeah. So Darwin married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. And looking at the family tree, this wasn't just a one-off romantic accident.
Not at all. The Darwin-Wedgwood dynasty was incredibly intertwined over generations. His grandparents were cousins, his wife's parents were cousins. It was a very common way of keeping money and property tightly within the family. The Wedgwoods were wealthy pottery tycoons. The Darwins were prominent intellectuals. They wanted to keep the good stuff in-house.
But Darwin was deeply worried about this. He wasn't just casually engaging in it without a second thought.
He was completely terrified. You have to remember, Darwin was a man plagued by intense anxiety anyway, and his greatest fear was his children's health. He had 10 children total. 3 of them died in childhood. His favorite daughter, Annie, died at age 10. It absolutely destroyed him. He actually stopped going to church after her death.
And he thought it was his fault, biologically his fault.
He was haunted by the idea that his marriage, his own bloodline, was the root cause. He looked at his surviving sons, some of whom were constantly sickly, or he described as backward, and he thought he was seeing the direct consequences of inbreeding. He even tried to get a question about cousin marriage included in the 1871 National Census to gather data on it, but Parliament rejected it.
So being Charles Darwin, he didn't just sit and worry. He experimented.
He turned to his plants again. He ran massive meticulous experiments at Downhouse, specifically using morning glories. He forced some plants to self-fertilize, which is essentially extreme inbreeding, and allowed others to cross-fertilize naturally with different plants.
And what were the results of these experiments?
Overwhelming. He ran this study for 11 straight years. The crossbred plants were taller, stronger, and produced far more seeds. The inbred plants were runts. They withered. They succumbed to disease. He concluded emphatically, nature abhors perpetual self-fertilization.
Why, though? What is the actual biological reason inbreeding is so bad? We all know socially it is bad, but what is actually happening in the DNA?
It is all about recessive genes. Every single one of us carries broken genes, harmful mutations. But usually we have a healthy backup copy from one parent that masks the broken copy from the other parent. This state is called heterozygosity. You really want to be heterozygous.
Okay, makes sense. You have a backup.
But if you marry your first cousin, you share a grandmother. You share that exact same broken DNA. The statistical chance of your child inheriting 2 broken copies skyrockets. This is called homozygosity. The protective mask is removed, and the genetic disease activates.
Like the famous Habsburg jaw in European royalty.
Exactly. Or cystic fibrosis. Or the terrible issues with the Soay sheep mentioned in the text.
The sheep on that remote island.
Yes. On the isolated island of Soay, the sheep that are freely inbred have far less genetic variation. They simply cannot fight off parasites effectively. In a harsh winter, the inbred sheep die in droves because they are completely full of worms. The outbred sheep with diverse immune systems survive. Genetic variation is the literal armor against death.
And we see this exact principle in modern conservation, too. The Florida panther story is a great example of this.
A fantastic success story.
Hmm.
The Florida panther population was down to just a handful of individuals in the wild. They were heavily inbred, they had kinked tails, heart defects, undescended testicles. They were biologically doomed.
So what did the conservationists do?
They flew in some cougars from Texas. Fresh, distinct DNA.
The little long-distance Texas romance.
Exactly. They introduced brand new genetic variation into the stagnant pool. The resulting kittens were robust and healthy. The physical defects vanished, and the population rebounded. It proved definitively that genetic rescue works.
But plants and animals have ways to avoid this naturally in the wild, right? They don't have societal laws against marrying cousins, so how do they physically stop it?
Chemical warfare, or at least highly specific chemical identification. In the plant world, it is known as self-incompatibility.
The pollen wars.
Yes. A female flower can chemically taste the pollen that lands on its stigma. If the pollen contains the exact same genetic markers as the mother plant, meaning it is from a close relative or itself, the flower will chemically block it. It will physically prevent the pollen tube from growing. It effectively says, "You are too much like me, access denied."
That is incredible. A flower can recognize its own siblings. And what about animals? The notes mention mouse urine.
I am afraid so, yes.
Yeah.
Female mice are very discerning when choosing a mate. They will carefully sniff the urine of a potential male.
Highly romantic.
Highly practical. They are actually smelling the MHC genes directly related to the immune system. They strongly prefer males that have entirely different immune genes than their own.
Because that guarantees their babies will have a broader, better immune system.
Correct. Diversity creates a much stronger shield against unpredictable diseases. If a female mouse smells a male that smells genetically like her brother, she instantly loses interest. It is an innate, hardwired biological drive for diversity.
Does this apply to humans at all? What about those famous t-shirt sniffing studies?
It is heavily debated. Some studies do suggest women prefer the scent of t-shirts worn by men with different immune genes. But the effect, if it exists, is extremely subtle. We are primarily a visual and social species, and we have perfumes and deodorants. We have largely masked our underlying biological sense signals.
And we also have surnames. Darwin's own son, George, actually tried to use surnames to study human inbreeding, right?
He did. He was a mathematician, and he figured that if two people have the exact same rare surname, they're very likely to be related. So he studied the rowing crews at Oxford and Cambridge, the supposedly well-bred upper-class men, to see if they were products of cousin marriage. He actually found they were slightly less inbred than the general population of hospitals and asylums.
Which is good news for the rowing team, I guess.
It is, but it really shows how the Darwin family was trying to apply rigorous scientific data to their own social class. They were desperately trying to solve the problem that haunted their own family history.
So bringing this all together now, we have gone from the queen's disgusted reaction to an orangutan, to the electrical memory of a Venus flytrap, to the royal wedding bed. What is the big ultimate takeaway here?
The grand synthesis is simply this: we are not separate from the rest of the natural world. That was the great Victorian mistake, thinking man was an angel and the rest was just base nature. Darwin showed conclusively that the exact same rules apply to everyone and everything.
The blushing bride and the trapping plant.
Precisely. Whether it is a human blushing to show social submission to the tribe, or a plant developing a complex snap trap to get scarce nitrogen, or a sheep dying of worms because of a lack of genetic diversity, it is all driven by the exact same force. It is natural selection. It is the relentless struggle for resources and mates.
And Darwin figured all of this out without electron microscopes, without DNA sequencing, without computers. He just simply looked.
He looked closely at the humble things. He didn't need to go back to the exotic Galapagos. He found the profound answers in the worms churning his lawn and the common weeds growing in his garden. He showed us that if you look closely enough at absolutely anything, you will see the entire history of life on Earth.
That is a truly powerful thought. But before we wrap up, we always need to leave our listeners with something to chew on. A final provocative thought.
Well, think about those green tyrannosaurs we discussed, the carnivorous plants. They evolved their incredible traps precisely because they were isolated in starving, nutrient-poor environments. They needed to be highly specialized and unique just to survive.
Right. They needed to become literal monsters to live in the poorest soil.
But look at what we are doing today. We are connecting everything globally. We are flooding the entire world with cheap artificial fertilizer. We are rapidly mixing populations of plants, animals, and humans through unprecedented global travel. We are systematically removing the geographical isolation.
So we are flattening the world.
In a purely evolutionary sense, yes. We are removing the very localized pressures that created such wondrous diversity in the first place. If every soil is rich, you do not need to be a Venus flytrap. If every population constantly mixes you, you lose the highly unique adaptations of the isolated group. We are slowly creating a global biological supermarket. It is efficient, perhaps, but it is completely uniform.
Mm.
Are we unwittingly driving the world toward a state where the unique, the weird, and the highly specialized simply have no biological reason to exist anymore?
Are we making the natural world boring?
Biologically boring. FL.
Oh,
And losing that diversity is a very dangerous thing for the resilience of the planet.
wow. Okay, well, on that somewhat terrifying note, don't over-fertilize your lawn, people. Save the fly traps.
Or at least just appreciate the weirdness of nature while it is still here around us.
Exactly. Thank you for listening to this deep talk. We hope you learned something fascinating today. We will see you next time.